After 35 years of hunting white-collar criminals for a living, I thought I could spot a fraud from across a crowded room. I was right. I just never imagined the fraud would be sitting at my own retirement dinner, cutting into the prime rib I paid for, smiling at me with my daughter's hand in his. His name was Marcus Webb. He had been married to my daughter, Claire, for 4 years. He called me Dad. He called me his mentor. He called me the wisest man he had ever known. On the night of my retirement dinner at the Chicago Athletic Association, I watched him slide a document into my briefcase while he thought I was shaking hands with my former colleagues across the room. In the next 72 hours, I discovered he had been stealing from me for 18 months. I discovered my wife had been gaslit into believing I was losing my mind. And I discovered that the most important case of my career was the one I would have to solve without a badge, without a firm, and without anyone in my own family believing me. I am 63 years old. I built Caldwell & Associates from a single desk in a shared office space to a 14-person forensic accounting firm that recovered over $400 million in fraudulent assets over 3 decades. I have testified in federal court. I have brought down a city alderman, a hospital CFO, and a hedge fund manager who thought he was untouchable. I know how fraud works. I know the psychology, the paper trails, the small behavioral tells, the blink rate, the micro expressions, the way a guilty man holds his glass. That is exactly why what Marcus Webb pulled off was both the most insulting and most audacious crime I had ever witnessed. He did it inside my own home, my own finances, my own marriage. He built his scheme on the one assumption that a man who retired was also a man who stopped paying attention. He was wrong. The retirement dinner was held on a Friday evening in November. The grand ballroom of the Chicago Athletic Association was everything my partners had promised. Dark wood paneling, crystal chandeliers, white-gloved waitstaff. My wife, Diane, had worn the navy dress she'd been saving for the occasion. Claire sat beside my son-in-law at the front table, looking beautiful and just slightly tired in the way she always did lately. A weariness around her eyes that I had been chalking up to a demanding job. I was at the podium for most of the first hour, accepting toasts, plaques, the good-natured jokes about finally being free of the office. My briefcase was on the floor beneath the head table. It held nothing sensitive, just the program, a spare tie, my reading glasses. It was during the applause for my partner Raymond's toast that I happened to glance over. I had positioned myself at an angle, out of habit. 35 years of depositions teach you to track the whole room, not just the person talking to you. My son-in-law was at the briefcase. He was crouched low, one knee on the floor, his right hand moving with a practiced efficiency that made the back of my neck go cold. His other hand was in his jacket pocket. The motion lasted 4 seconds. He straightened, adjusted his tie, and rejoined the applause before anyone else at the table looked his way. 4 seconds. Most people would have seen a man who dropped his napkin and reached to pick it up. I saw a man who had rehearsed that movement. I did not confront him. I did not change my expression. I finished my remarks, posed for photographs, and said goodbye to my colleagues with the same warmth and gratitude I had planned for. I even clapped him on the shoulder as we were leaving and told him the dinner was wonderful. He beamed. He had no idea I had been watching. I waited until Diane was asleep. She had taken her half glass of wine and her novel to bed by 10:30, the way she always did. I listened until her breathing deepened. Then I got up, went to the study, and opened the briefcase on my desk under the lamp. The program was there, the spare tie, the reading glasses, and underneath the glasses, slipped into a side pocket I rarely used, was a single folded document. I put on my reading glasses and smoothed it flat on the desk. It was a financial power of attorney. The document named my son-in-law as the authorized agent with full discretionary authority over all accounts, investments, and real property held by James R. Caldwell and Diane M. Caldwell. The signatures at the bottom were mine and Diane's. I had never signed that document. I had never seen that document. And I was nearly certain that Diane had not either. I sat very still for a long time. The house made its nighttime noises around me. The radiator clicked. A car passed on the street outside. My hands were completely steady. This was not a moment for panic. Panic is for amateurs. I had spent my career in the wreckage of financial fraud, and I knew that the worst thing you can do in the first moments of discovery is react. You secure the evidence. You assess the exposure. You build the case before you show your hand. I took photographs of every line of the document with my phone. I noted the notary stamp, a name I didn't recognize, a firm I would need to look up. I refolded the paper and replaced it exactly where I had found it. Then I went to my desk drawer and pulled out the external hard drive I kept for sensitive work. I had a lot to do before morning. By 3 in the morning, I had accessed 3 months of bank statements from the joint savings account my son-in-law had insisted on setting up for what he called estate planning purposes 18 months earlier. He had suggested it with such generosity, framing it as a way to streamline the transfer of assets for tax efficiency. I had agreed, thinking it was reasonable. I had allowed him access as a co-signatory because he was family, because my daughter loved him, because I trusted her judgment. The transfers started small, a few thousand here, linked to a consulting invoice from a company called Stonegate Capital Group. I pulled up the Illinois Secretary of State records on my laptop. Stonegate Capital Group had been incorporated 20 months ago. The registered agent was a law firm in Schaumburg. The sole manager of record was listed as a Michelle Voss. I typed that name into my search engine and cross-referenced with public records. It took 11 minutes. Michelle Voss was the leasing agent at the building where my son-in-law maintained a secondary office. She was also, based on her social media presence, someone who had been vacationing in Turks and Caicos with a man whose back was to the camera in several photographs, but whose build, watch, and wedding ring were all consistent with my son-in-law. By 4 in the morning, I had identified 9 wire transfers over the previous 14 months totaling $2.1 million, all flowing from the joint account through Stonegate Capital Group to an account I had not yet traced. $2.1 million. The money I had spent 35 years saving, investing, protecting. The money meant to secure my wife's retirement, to fund my grandchildren's education someday, to carry this family forward. And he had been bleeding it out a few $100,000 at a time, steady and slow, like a surgeon managing blood loss so the monitor doesn't spike. I closed the laptop. I went to the kitchen and made coffee. I stood at the window watching the sky turn from black to the blue-gray of early morning. I needed to be precise. I needed to be methodical, and I needed to do it alone, because I already had a terrible suspicion that by the time I brought this to light, I was not going to have many people in my corner. I was right about that too. The first indication came 2 days later at Sunday dinner. My daughter had been hosting Sunday dinners at their house in Lincoln Park since they bought the place 3 years ago. It was a ritual I valued. Real plates, proper food, unhurried conversation. My son-in-law was at the stove when I arrived, stirring something with the focused expression of a man who wanted you to notice how hard he was working. My daughter opened the door and hugged me with that slightly compressed energy I had been noticing for months, like someone managing an invisible weight. Diane was already at the table with a glass of white wine, her cheeks flushed in a way that seemed off for one glass. She had seemed foggy recently, slower to laugh, quicker to defer to my son-in-law's framing of things. I had mentioned it to her, and she had told me I was being overprotective. I had let it go. I sat down. My son-in-law brought the food out with his characteristic showmanship, narrating each dish. I ate. I asked questions about Claire's job. I complimented the meal, and the entire time I was watching, he watched me back. The shift was subtle, but present. He was more attentive than usual, more solicitous, refilling my water, laughing a half-beat longer at my jokes. It was the behavior of a man recalibrating, checking for cracks. He wanted to know if I had found what he had put in my briefcase. I gave him nothing. After dinner, while Claire and I were clearing plates in the kitchen, I asked her quietly how she was really doing. She paused with a plate in her hand. "Fine, Dad," she said. "Just tired." She said it the way people say it when tired isn't the right word, but they're not ready to use the right word yet. "Has your husband been under a lot of pressure lately?" I asked. She set the plate down and looked at the window above the sink instead of at me. "He has a lot going on," she said carefully. "He mentioned you asked him about the joint account last month." She paused. He was a little worried. He said you seemed confused about some of the transfers. I had not asked my son-in-law about the joint account. I had not spoken to him about finances at all in recent months. I smiled at my daughter. It was nothing, I told her. I misread a statement. You know how it is. Eyes getting old. She visibly relaxed. She squeezed my arm. He really does look up to you, Dad, she said. He just wants to help. I nodded and walked back to the dining room. My son-in-law was pouring after-dinner bourbon at the sideboard, his back to me. His shoulders were loose. He thought the conversation in the kitchen had gone his way. I had just confirmed everything I needed to know. He had already been planting the seed with Claire. Confused about the transfers. Eyes getting old. The groundwork for Dad's not quite all there anymore was already laid. If the power of attorney surfaced, he had a narrative ready. The old man was losing his grip, signing things he didn't remember, needing a steady hand to manage his affairs. I had seen this playbook before. I had testified against a financial advisor who ran this exact scheme on 14 elderly clients over 7 years. The difference was that those victims didn't know what was happening until the money was gone. Marcus had been living under my roof, eating my food, and building his case for 18 months. He was good. He was patient. He was ruthless. He had just picked the wrong target. I spent the next 3 weeks moving quietly. I retained an attorney, not the estate attorney my son-in-law knew about, but a litigation partner named Helen Marsh, who owed me a professional courtesy from a case we had collaborated on years earlier. I transferred my primary investment accounts to a new brokerage under a different tax identification, citing a routine internal audit. I requested a full forensic image of the joint account records going back to inception, and I hired a private investigator, a former FBI financial crimes agent named Gary Turvey, to trace the downstream accounts connected to Stonegate Capital Group. Gary called me on a Wednesday morning 3 weeks later. His voice was flat and professional in the way of men who have stopped being surprised by people. The money went to 3 places, he told me. One account belongs to Michelle Voss. One is a brokerage account in your son-in-law's name, held through a shell entity in Delaware. And the third is a property in Scottsdale, Arizona. A house, purchased 9 months ago for $800,000. Deed lists him as sole owner. Not disclosed as a marital asset. Not disclosed to you. I sat with that for a moment. A house in Scottsdale. Half of everything I had set aside for Diane's future. He was not planning to grow old here, I said. Gary was quiet for a second. The transfer pattern matches a controlled liquidation strategy, he said, draining accessible accounts while leaving the long-term trust intact so the target doesn't notice a drop in their lifestyle. Classic long game. What's the timeline on the power of attorney? It was notarized 3 weeks before my retirement dinner, I said. Never filed with the court. He needed the window to file it in case something happened to me before he was ready to move. Or in case you discovered it, Gary said. Yes, I said. Or that. Then I told him about Diane, about the fog, the deference, the way she had become a slightly softer and less certain version of herself over the past year. I asked him to look into her prescriptions. He called back 3 days later. His voice had a different quality, less professional, more careful. Her general practitioner switched her from her regular medication to a compounding prescription 13 months ago, he said. The switch was recommended by a specialist she was referred to through your son-in-law. The specialist is real, board certified, but he receives referral bonuses from a pharmaceutical consulting group that your son-in-law has been a paid advisor for. The compound includes standard components, but at dosages significantly above the therapeutic range for a woman her age and weight. The side effects of long-term administration at those levels look a great deal like early cognitive decline. I put the phone down on my desk and did not pick it up for a full minute. He had medicated my wife. He had blurred her mind with a prescription she trusted because her own doctor had guided her to it, not knowing that doctor had been pointed in that direction. He had turned the woman who had been my partner for 37 years into a softer, slower, more manageable version of herself, and I had noticed it and worried about it, and she had told me I was being overprotective. He had not just stolen my money. He had stolen her. I set the meeting for a Thursday evening. I chose the conference room at Helen's firm on Michigan Avenue, 20 floors up with a view of the lake. I told Claire and Diane that I wanted a routine year-end financial review now that I was retired. I told them to bring my son-in-law because I valued his perspective. He dressed for the occasion. The good navy suit, the expensive watch, the expression of a man who had rehearsed confidence until it became instinct. He shook Helen's hand with both of his, the double-grip handshake that signals warmth and is almost never genuine. I let him settle in. I let everyone get their water, their notepad, their comfortable position. I looked at Diane, who smiled at me with the soft, slightly unfocused warmth that had replaced her sharpness. I looked at Claire, who was watching her husband adjust his cufflinks. Then I opened the folder. The first document I set down was the power of attorney. Printed alongside the original filing log, Gary had traced to the notary. "Marcus," I said, "I'd like to start with this." I watched his face. He looked at the document. His expression did not change in the way a guilty man's expression doesn't change when it is working too hard not to. He looked up at me with careful, measured concern. "Dad, I can explain," he began. "I know you can," I said. "But I'd like you to listen first." I set down the Stonegate Capital Group registration. I set down the wire transfer summary. 9 transfers, 14 months, $2.1 million. I set down the Scottsdale property deed. I set down Gary's report on the pharmaceutical referral chain. I set down the photographs from Michelle Voss's social media, printed in color, with the watch and the wedding ring circled in red. Each page landed on the table like a court exhibit. Methodical, irrefutable. Claire had gone completely still. She was not looking at the documents. She was looking at her husband. Diane was looking at the pharmaceutical report. Something was happening in her face. A slow recognition, like a person surfacing from deep water and understanding for the first time how far down they had been. My son-in-law looked at me with a smile 1 layer too thin. "I appreciate you putting this together," he started. "But I think there's significant context missing here." Helen held up one finger. She did not raise her voice. She said, "Mr. Webb, you're in my conference room. I'm going to stop you there." He looked at her. "You've been served," she said, and slid a legal envelope across the table. He looked at me. He looked at Claire. He shifted register that practiced softening of the voice he always used when he was managing her, and said, "Honey, you know me. You know none of this is what it—" "Don't," Claire said. One word. The way she said it told me that whatever had settled over her these past years, she was burning through it now in real time, right there in that room. My son-in-law turned back to me. His composure had developed fissures. "You think this makes you look like the hero?" he said. "Spying on your own son-in-law, hiring investigators, dragging your family into a conference room? You've blown up this family over your own paranoia." "No," I said. "You built something on my family's trust and my wife's health and my daughter's belief in you. I'm just the one who documented it." He picked up his jacket from the chair. Helen had already pressed the intercom on the conference room phone. The door opened. 2 officers from the Chicago Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit stepped inside. They had been in the waiting area for 40 minutes. My son-in-law looked at the door. The calculation in his eyes was fast and visible, the expression of a man running out of angles. He sat back down. The next several hours were paperwork, forms, statements, the deliberate language of due process. Claire sat beside Diane at the end of the table and held her mother's hand without saying a word. Diane did not cry. She sat very straight and answered every question the officers asked, in a voice that was slow but clear, a woman pulling herself back to the surface through will alone. She had signed the power of attorney. She admitted that. She said she had been told it was estate planning routine, something I had asked him to handle on my behalf. She said she had been very tired that week. She said she was sorry, quietly and directly to me across the table, and I felt the full weight of everything that word carried. My son-in-law was taken into custody on preliminary charges of wire fraud, forgery, and financial elder abuse. His attorney had him out on bond before midnight. These men always have an attorney. I drove Diane home. She sat in the passenger seat watching the city move past the window. Somewhere on the expressway, she said. I kept telling myself something felt wrong. I kept choosing not to trust it. He made me feel like not trusting my instincts was the rational thing to do. That's the mechanism, I told her. That's how it works. She turned and looked at me. Why didn't you tell me what you found? Because by the time I found it, he had already been working on you for over a year, I said. If I had come to you with documents before I had the full picture, before we had the pharmacy report, he would have had enough of your trust left to explain it away. I needed you to see it all at once. I needed there to be no room left for his version. She was quiet for a long while. I should have seen it, she said finally. You were medicated, Diane, I said. You weren't yourself. That wasn't a failure of judgment. That was a crime committed against you. There's a difference. And you need to hold on to that difference. She put her hand on mine, on the gear shift. We drove the rest of the way home without speaking, and the silence between us was not the silence of distance. It was the silence of two people who had survived something together and were still figuring out what came next. The criminal case moved the way financial fraud cases always move, slowly, deliberately, with a great deal of paper. My son-in-law's defense argued that the transfers were legitimate consulting fees, that the power of attorney had been signed voluntarily, and that any confusion on Diane's part reflected her own age-related memory issues rather than anything induced. It was a strategy built entirely on making the victims appear incompetent. I had expected it. Helen had prepared for it. Gary Turvey testified for 3 hours. A pharmacologist from Northwestern testified about the effects of sustained high-dose benzodiazepine administration in patients over 60. Helen walked the jury through the wire transfer records with the patience and precision of someone who understood that people follow money when you make the path visible. The case turned not in a dramatic single moment, but in a recording, recovered from Michelle Voss's voicemail through a warrant served on her carrier. It was a message my son-in-law had left 11 months before my retirement dinner. The prosecutor played it in open court without preamble. His voice came through the courtroom speakers, unhurried and clear. The old man is basically checked out. Diane manages herself at this point. Another 8 months and we file. Have the Scottsdale house ready by spring. The room was silent. He looked at the table. Claire was in the gallery 2 rows behind me. I heard her exhale, not a sob. Something steadier than that. The sound of a person releasing a weight they had been carrying so long they had stopped noticing it. The jury deliberated for 4 days. They returned guilty verdicts on 7 counts. The sentencing was 11 years. The civil judgment recovered $1.8 million. The Scottsdale property was seized and liquidated. Michelle Voss reached a separate civil settlement. The money came back. Not all of it, but most. That mattered less than I thought it would. What took longer was everything else. Diane was gradually weaned off the compounded prescription under the supervision of a specialist. I selected myself, someone with no connection to anyone my son-in-law had ever known. It took 4 months for the fog to fully lift. I watched it happen in increments, like watching a window come clean in slow stages. The sharpness returned, the wit that had made me fall in love with her decades ago, the particular way she would push back on my certainties and be right about half the time, a frequency I had always found both maddening and essential. One evening she was sitting at the kitchen counter reading the newspaper and she said, without looking up, "You know what I want to do?" "What's that?" I said. "Portugal," she said. "Just the 2 of us. 2 weeks. Somewhere neither of us has been." I told her I thought that was a very good idea. Claire took longer. Her recovery was not chemical but structural, the slow work of rebuilding trust in her own perception, her own instincts, her own judgment after 4 years of having all 3 systematically undermined. She moved into a smaller apartment in Wicker Park, traded the car he had chosen for her for one she picked herself, and started seeing a therapist who specialized in financial and emotional coercion. There was a period when she was angry at me. Not for what I had done, she understood what I had done, but for the scale of what had been happening inside her own marriage without her seeing it. I let her be angry. It was the right anger directed at the right injury, and it would do its work in its own time. In April, she called and asked if she could come for dinner. Not at her place, at ours. She said she wanted Diane's pot roast. She said she wanted to sit at the table she grew up at. She came. We ate. We did not talk about the case, or the money, or the man who had tried to erase me while eating at this same table. We talked about Portugal. We talked about a book she was reading. We talked about whether Diane's hydrangeas along the back fence were going to survive another Chicago winter, which was a conversation we had every year, and the answer was always the same. After dinner, while Diane was washing up, Claire sat with me in the living room. The lamp was on the way it used to be when she was in high school, and we would stay up late just talking. She sat with her knees pulled up, the way she had always sat since she was small. She said, "I keep thinking about what you must have been carrying, those 3 weeks, knowing what you knew and not being able to tell anyone. It wasn't easy." I said honestly, "Were you afraid I wouldn't believe you?" She asked. "I was afraid it wouldn't matter if you did," I told her. He had enough ground prepared. I loved you too much to hand him one more opportunity to use that against me. She looked at the lamp for a long moment. "I thought it was you," she said quietly. "When he started saying you seemed confused, I didn't want to believe it, but I didn't want to dismiss it either. I kept thinking, what if he's right, and I'm just not paying attention? I thought taking it seriously was what a good daughter would do." "You were a good daughter," I said. "He handed you a false instrument, and you used it in good faith. That's not a failure of character. That's what makes it fraud." She looked at me. "You sound like a forensic accountant," she said. I smiled. "Old habits." She put her head on my shoulder the way she had when she was young, and we would watch the late news together, which she was never officially allowed to do but always managed anyway. We sat like that with the lamp on and Diane moving around in the kitchen and the street outside quiet. There are men who will look at everything you have built and see only a number to extract. They will smile over your food and call you family, and quietly calculate the rate of your decline. They will make you feel that your instincts are the problem and their management of you is the solution. They will bet on your trust, your age, your love for the people standing next to them. I spent my career finding these men. I know how they think because I know how the money moves. I know that a fraud is never only about money, it is about control. It is about a person deciding that your life's work, your future, your family, belongs to them by right of proximity and patience. What I want you to hear, if you are sitting right now with a suspicion you keep talking yourself out of, is this: trust the suspicion. You are not being paranoid. You are paying attention. There is a real difference between those two things, and the people who benefit from your doubt will always try to collapse that difference. Diane and I raised our glasses on a terrace above the Douro Valley on a Tuesday evening in May. The sun was going down over the vineyards, turning everything amber and slow. There was no one else at the table. There was no one whose hands I needed to watch. There was no one performing care while calculating my expiration date. I just lifted the glass. I looked at my wife sharp again, present again, annoyed at me again in all the ways I had quietly missed, and I drank. It was a clean life. I had almost lost it. I had almost been managed out of it by a man who wore my trust like a key. But I had built a career on a single professional truth. The fraud always leaves a trail, and the trail always leads home. If this story spoke to you, please subscribe to the channel and ring that notification bell so you never miss what's next. Leave me a comment and tell me, have you ever had to choose between trusting your instincts and trusting the people you love most? I want to hear from you.